The moment my mother-in-law deliberately spilled red wine on my white designer dress at the charity gala and laughed it off as an accident, I knew this was war. But what she didn't know was that I held the keys to her precious son's entire empire, and tonight at this exclusive restaurant, I was about to show her exactly who she'd been underestimating for years. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of Lucille d'Or, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where tables were booked months in advance, and where the elite gathered to flaunt their status and connections. Yet here I stood at the entrance watching the maitre d' shuffle nervously, as he delivered news that would change everything, news that would finally expose the carefully orchestrated humiliation my other-in-law Morgan Sinclair had planned with surgical precision, not knowing that her elaborate scheme would become the catalyst for her own downfall, and the moment I would finally unleash the power I'd been quietly accumulating throughout my marriage to her spineless son Adam. The maitre d' cleared his throat apologetically as he scanned his leather-bound reservation book once more, his fingers trembling slightly as if he sensed the storm brewing beneath my composed exterior, while behind him the restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of New York's most influential families, their designer clothes and glittering jewelry creating a tableau of wealth and privilege that Morgan had always insisted I could never truly belong to, despite the fact that I'd built my own success low before I'd ever met her precious son. A fact she'd conveniently chosen to ignore in her relentless campaign to paint me as nothing more than a gold-digging outsider who had somehow manipulated her way into their illustrious family circle. I maintained my professional smile even as the maitre d' shook his head with what appeared to be genuine regret, explaining that while there was indeed a reservation for 6 under the Sinclair name, my name was conspicuously absent from the guest list. A detail so precisely calculated that it could only have been intentional, especially considering Morgan's history of passive-aggressive warfare disguised as social oversight. From the wedding rehearsal dinner, where my entire family had been mysteriously left off the guest list, to the countless family gatherings, where my place card would somehow vanish moments before dinner was served. Each incident carefully orchestrated to remind me of my supposed place in the hierarchy she'd constructed in her mind. The sharp click of designer heels on marble announced Morgan's arrival, before her voice cut through the ambient restaurant chatter like a blade wrapped in silk, her tone dripping with that particular brand of condescension she'd perfected over decades of looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her station, which in her mind included virtually everyone who hadn't been born into old money or attended the right schools or belonged to the right clubs, categories I failed to meet despite my own considerable achievements in the culinary world and business ventures that had quietly surpassed anything her son had managed to accomplish on his own. "Oh, Claire." Morgan's voice rang out with theatrical surprise as she approached the podium where I stood, her Chanel suit impeccably tailored and her platinum blonde hair styled to perfection as always, every detail of her appearance calculated to project an image of effortless superiority, while behind her I could see Adam shifting uncomfortably in his seat at their table, his sisters Charlotte and Emma already whispering and giggling like schoolgirls at what they clearly expected to be another victorious moment in their mother's ongoing campaign against me. None of them realizing that tonight would mark the end of their little games and the beginning of my triumph. "Did you really think I'd include you in tonight's family dinner?" Morgan continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass, as she positioned herself strategically between me and the dining room, effectively blocking my view of the table where my husband sat in his typical state of passive compliance, a man so thoroughly dominated by his mother that he'd never once stood up for me in all our years of marriage despite claiming to love me. His silence in these moments speaking volumes about his true character and the fundamental weakness that I'd finally acknowledged after years of making excuses for his behavior. Morgan's designer handbag swung casually from her arm as she tilted her head in mock concern, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the nearby diners could hear every carefully chosen word, as she delivered what she clearly believed would be the killing blow to my dignity, explaining with exaggerated patience that this particular restaurant was perhaps a bit beyond my usual sphere, suggesting that perhaps I might be more comfortable at one of those charming little bistros downtown where the prices were more in line with my background, a background she knew nothing about despite her constant attempts to diminish it, her ignorance about my past about to become the very weapon that would destroy her carefully maintained facade of superiority. The other diners were beginning to take notice now, their conversations trailing off as they sensed the drama unfolding at the entrance, some leaning slightly forward in their seats to catch every word, while others pretended to study their menus with sudden intense interest. All of them recognizing the familiar dance of social warfare that played out regularly among their circle, but none of them expecting the spectacular reversal that was about to unfold before their eyes. A reversal that would become legendary in certain social circles, and would forever change the power dynamic in the Sinclair family. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze as Morgan continued her performance, each word carefully crafted to maximize my humiliation, while maintaining her own image of refined cruelty. The kind of behavior that was somehow considered acceptable among her set, as long as it was delivered with the right tone, and the proper amount of plausible deniability, a skill she'd honed through years of practice on various daughters-in-law and social climbers who had dared to enter her carefully guarded realm without her express approval or pedigree. Charlotte's snicker echoed across the space between us as Morgan delivered another barb, about how some people simply didn't understand the unspoken rules of high society, how they persisted in showing up where they weren't wanted, how they failed to recognize the subtle signals that should have kept them in their proper place. Each comment a dagger aimed at my heart, or at least where my heart would have been if I hadn't spent the last few years building an armor of indifference to her particular brand of psychological warfare. An armor that was about to transform into the most unexpected of weapons. The familiar burn of humiliation should have been coursing through my veins as I stood there, the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. My husband's silence more damning than any words his mother could speak. But instead I felt something entirely different stirring within me, a cool, calculated confidence that had been building for months, perhaps years, waiting for exactly this moment to emerge. The moment when Morgan would finally overplay her hand, and give me the perfect opportunity to reveal just how thoroughly she had underestimated the woman she'd been trying to break. Adam's continued silence spoke volumes about the man I'd married. The man who had promised to love and protect me but who consistently chose the path of least resistance when it came to his mother's behavior, his weakness disguised as diplomacy, his cowardice masquerading as keeping the peace, never once considering that his refusal to take a stand was itself a choice that prioritized his own comfort over his wife's dignity. A choice that had slowly but surely eroded the foundation of our marriage until nothing remained but legal documents and shared assets. Assets that he didn't even fully understand the nature of. Emma's gaze flickered between her mother and me, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression as she perhaps sensed that something was different about tonight. That my usual response of quiet dignity in the face of Morgan's attacks had been replaced by something else entirely. Something that made her shift slightly in her seat, and exchange a glance with Charlotte, who was still riding high on the assumption that this would be another victory in their mother's campaign to put me in my place. Neither of them realizing that they were about to witness the complete dismantling of their family's power structure. The maitre d' stood frozen between us, clearly uncomfortable with the scene playing out in his establishment, but unsure how to proceed. His training in handling difficult situations among the elite apparently not covering this particular scenario where one of the city's most prominent socialites was openly humiliating her daughter-in-law in full view of the dinner crowd. His discomfort about to transform into shock as I played the card I'd been holding in reserve for precisely this moment. A card that would flip the entire script and leave Morgan scrambling to maintain her composure. I let Morgan finish her little speech about how certain people needed to learn their place in the social hierarchy, how breeding and background couldn't be faked no matter how hard one tried, how there were simply some circles that remained forever closed to outsiders regardless of whom they married, each word digging her deeper into a hole she didn't even realize she was creating. Her arrogance blinding her to the fact that she was speaking to someone who had spent years quietly building relationships and accumulating power in the very world she claimed to rule. Someone who had been patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to reveal just how hollow her supposed superiority really was. The smile that curved my lips wasn't the polite, practiced expression I usually wore in Morgan's presence, but something entirely different, genuine amusement mixed with anticipation. The kind of smile that made her falter for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible crack in her facade that told me she had finally sensed that something was different about tonight. That perhaps she had pushed too far, orchestrated one humiliation too many, not realizing that she had just handed me the perfect stage for my reveal. A reveal that would not only destroy her attempt to embarrass me, but would fundamentally alter the power dynamic she had taken for granted for so long. Without breaking eye contact with Morgan, I turned slightly toward the maitre d', my voice calm and pleasant as I made the request that would change everything, asking him with perfect politeness if he would be so kind as to ask the owner to come out for a moment. Watching as Morgan's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to incredulous amusement, clearly believing that I was about to embarrass myself even further by presuming that the owner of such an exclusive establishment would deign to appear simply because I had asked. Her laughter ringing out across the entrance as she mocked my apparent delusion. "Oh please," Morgan scoffed, her voice dripping with derision as she glanced around to ensure her audience was properly appreciating her wit. "Do you really think the owner of Lucille d'Or is going to come running just because you asked? As if you were someone of importance rather than just my son's unfortunate choice of wife." Her words designed to cut deep, to remind me once again of my supposed place in her carefully constructed hierarchy, not realizing that she was seconds away from discovering just how wrong she had been about everything, about my connections, my past, my power, and most importantly, about who truly held the cards in this relationship. The maitre d' hesitated, clearly torn between his training to accommodate requests and his assessment of the social dynamics at play. But before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension, warm and welcoming in a way that made Morgan's head snap around in surprise, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Daniel Laurent himself emerging from the kitchen passage, his presence commanding immediate attention even among this crowd of influential diners, his gaze finding mine with unmistakable recognition and something more genuine respect, the kind that couldn't be faked or bought, the kind that came from shared history and mutual professional admiration. Daniel's appearance was everything Morgan valued. Expensive suit perfectly tailored, silver hair that spoke of distinguished age and wisdom, the kind of natural authority that came from building an empire from the ground up. Yet his warm greeting was directed not at her, despite her obvious expectation, but at me, his voice carrying clearly across the space as he called my name with familiar affection, the sound of it causing a ripple of whispers among the nearby tables, as people began to reassess their understanding of the drama unfolding before them. Their preconceptions about the poor outsider being humiliated by her powerful mother-in-law suddenly called into question. The look on Morgan's face was priceless, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of real concern as she watched Daniel approach me with open arms, his greeting making it clear that this was no casual acquaintance, but a relationship built on genuine history and mutual respect. The kind of relationship that couldn't be dismissed or explained away by her usual narratives about gold diggers and social climbers, forcing her to confront the possibility that perhaps she didn't know as much about her daughter-in-law as she had assumed. "Claire," Daniel said warmly, taking my hands in his, as he had done countless times during our years working together. It's been far too long since you graced my kitchen with your presence. His words carefully chosen to immediately establish not just familiarity but professional connection. The mention of his kitchen carrying weight in a room full of people who understood that access to the inner sanctum of a restaurant like Lucille d'Or was reserved for only the most trusted and respected individuals in the culinary world, a world that Morgan had dismissed as beneath her notice despite its enormous influence and prestige. I returned Daniel's greeting with genuine warmth, our brief exchange laden with the kind of shared understanding that comes from years of professional collaboration and mutual respect. Before turning to gesture toward the table where my so-called family sat frozen in various states of shock, explaining with deliberate casualness that there seemed to be some confusion about my reservation for tonight's dinner. Watching as Daniel's expression shifted from pleasure at seeing me to understanding, and then to something darker as he grasped the situation, his protective instincts kicking in just as they had years ago, when he first took me under his wing, as a young chef, trying to make her mark in a brutally competitive industry. The transformation in Daniel's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew him well. The slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional straightening of his already perfect posture, the way his professional smile took on an edge that promised consequences for those who had dared to disrespect someone he considered family. All of it combining to create an atmosphere of impending reckoning that even Morgan, despite her usual obliviousness to anything outside her narrow worldview, couldn't fail to notice. "That won't do at all," Daniel declared, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument, even from someone of Morgan's social standing. His gaze sweeping over the table where my husband and his family sat before returning to me with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the chill he had directed at them. The difference not lost on the watching diners, who were now fully invested in this unexpected dinner theater. Their own meals forgotten as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a significant social upset. Morgan, never one to accept defeat easily, attempted to rally with a dismissive laugh, her voice taking on that particular tone of condescension she reserved for service workers and anyone else she deemed beneath her station, as she pointed out that surely even someone of Daniel's position must understand that Lucille d'Or didn't simply accommodate unexpected guests, that reservations were made months in advance, that there were standards to maintain, each word digging her deeper into a hole she still didn't realize she was creating. Her fundamental misunderstanding of the situation about to be spectacularly exposed. Daniel's response was a masterclass in polite devastation. His agreement with Morgan's assessment of his restaurant's exclusivity, serving only to set up the revelation that followed, as he smoothly explained that while she was quite correct about their strict reservation policy, I was hardly what one would consider an unexpected guest. The pause before his next words perfectly timed to ensure maximum impact, as he delivered the blow that would shatter Morgan's carefully constructed narrative about my place in the world. "But Claire is not a walk-in," Daniel continued, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent entrance area. "She is family, and she is always welcome in my establishment, regardless of whether her name appears on a reservation or not," the emphasis on the word family landing like a physical blow on Morgan's composure, her face cycling through a series of expressions as she struggled to process this unexpected development. This crack in the foundation of everything she thought she knew about the woman she had spent years trying to diminish and dismiss. The ripple effect of Daniel's words spread through the assembled diners like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Conversations resuming in hushed tones as people began reassessing their understanding of the players in this social drama. Some nodding knowingly as if they had always suspected there was more to me than met the eye, others looking at Morgan with new interest, wondering how someone so supposedly connected could have so thoroughly misjudged a situation. The shift in the room's energy palpable, as the narrative Morgan had tried to establish crumbled before everyone's eyes. Charlotte's carefully maintained sneer began to falter, as she watched her mother struggle to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her expectations, while Emma seemed to shrink into her chair, perhaps realizing for the first time that their mother's campaign against me might have been built on catastrophically wrong assumptions. Their brother meanwhile maintaining his silence but now looking distinctly uncomfortable as he began to grasp the magnitude of his mother's miscalculation, and, by extension, his own failure to see me for who I truly was. Morgan's attempt to salvage the situation was almost painful to watch as she forced out a laugh that fooled no one, her voice taking on a brittle quality, as she suggested that there must be some misunderstanding, that surely Daniel was confusing me with someone else, that it was simply impossible for her son's wife to have the kind of connection to the culinary world that was being implied, each word revealing more of her desperation as she clung to her preconceptions rather than face the evidence mounting before her eyes, her worldview too rigid to accommodate this new information without shattering completely. That's when I decided to twist the knife just a little, not out of cruelty but out of a sense of justice long denied, as I explained with perfect calm that Daniel and I went way back, that before I had met Adam I had worked extensively in fine dining, that Daniel had been not just my mentor but my champion when I was starting out. Watching as each revelation landed like a blow on Morgan's increasingly fragile composure, her face growing paler as she realized just how badly she had misjudged not just my background, but my connections and influence in a world she had dismissed as beneath her notice. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of glassware as a nervous waiter moved past our group, the tension thick enough to cut with one of Daniel's expertly sharpened knives as Morgan visibly struggled to process this new information, her mind clearly racing to find some way to dismiss or diminish what she was hearing, but finding no purchase as Daniel himself stood there confirming every word, his presence and obvious respect for me making it impossible for her to maintain her cherished delusions about my supposed lack of worth. Adam finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled sound of surprise as he turned to look at me with new eyes, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time since we'd met, the realization dawning on him that he had married someone far more complex and accomplished than he had ever bothered to discover, his mother's influence having blinded him to the woman who had shared his bed and his life for years, a woman who had quietly built her own network of power and influence, while he remained trapped in the small world his mother had created for him. I watched with satisfaction as Daniel directed the maitre d' to prepare a place for me at the Sinclair table, the young man's relief at having clear direction evident as he sprang into action, efficiently directing staff to add a setting right next to Adam, the positioning clearly deliberate on Daniel's part as he ensured I would be seated in a place of honor rather than squeezed in at the end like an afterthought, every detail of his arrangements sending a clear message about my true status in his eyes, and by extension, in this rarefied world that Morgan claimed to rule. The look on Morgan's face as she realized she had no choice but to accept my presence at her carefully planned family dinner was worth every slight, every insult, every moment of humiliation she had inflicted over the years, her jaw working soundlessly as she tried to formulate some objection that wouldn't make her look even more petty and small-minded than she already did. Ultimately forced to watch in impotent fury as I was seated with all the deference typically reserved for their most valued guests, the other diners taking note of every detail of my treatment. Daniel's parting words put the final nail in the coffin of Morgan's attempted power play. His casual mention that he would have the chef prepare something special for me, explicitly stating it would be on the house, serving as both a gesture of friendship and a clear signal to everyone present about where the real power lay in this situation. The unspoken message clear. I was someone who commanded respect and special treatment in places where Morgan merely had reservations, a reversal of fortune so complete that even Charlotte seemed to grasp its significance. As I settled into my seat, accepting the wine that appeared as if by magic in front of me, I savored not just the excellent vintage but the expressions on the faces around the table: Morgan's barely controlled rage, Charlotte's confusion, Emma's nervous glances, and Adam's dawning realization that he had gravely underestimated his wife, all of them forced to reckon with the fact that their carefully constructed hierarchy had just been revealed as the illusion it had always been, built on assumptions and prejudices, rather than any real understanding of the world beyond their insular circle. The first course arrived with a flourish, an exquisite amuse-bouche that I recognized as one of Daniel's signature creations, updated and refined since I had last tasted it, but still carrying the distinctive flavor profile that had made his restaurant legendary. The presentation alone a work of art that drew appreciative murmurs from nearby tables, and forced even Morgan to acknowledge, if only through her silence, the exceptional nature of what had been placed before me, her own standard order suddenly seeming pedestrian by comparison. I took my time savoring each bite, allowing the complex flavors to unfold on my palate, while maintaining a pleasant expression that gave nothing away of my inner triumph, though I could feel Morgan's eyes on me, watching for any sign of discomfort or uncertainty, any indication that I might still be intimidated by the surroundings or the company, not realizing that I had spent years training in kitchens far more demanding than any social situation she could engineer. My composure forged in the fires of professional kitchens where mistakes could cost careers and reputations. The conversation around the table remained stilted and awkward, none of them quite sure how to proceed now that their planned evening of subtle humiliation had been so thoroughly derailed. Adam clearing his throat several times as if to speak before thinking better of it, his sisters exchanging meaningful looks that no longer carried their earlier smugness, while Morgan sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white around her wine glass, as she struggled to find some way to regain control of a situation that had slipped completely beyond her grasp. It was almost too perfect when Morgan, unable to contain herself any longer, attempted to salvage some shred of her dignity by making a pointed comment about how interesting it was that I had connections in the service industry, her emphasis on the words making it clear she still viewed my background as somehow lesser despite everything that had just transpired. The comment hanging in the air like a challenge as the others waited to see how I would respond, not realizing that she had just handed me another opportunity to demonstrate how thoroughly she had misjudged the situation. I let her words settle before responding with deliberate calm, taking another sip of wine before pointing out that the culinary world, she so dismissively referred to as the service industry, was in fact one of the most influential and interconnected professional networks in the city, that the relationships forged in professional kitchens often proved far more valuable than those made at charity galas or country clubs, watching as my words found their mark, each one chipping away at the foundation of superiority she had built her identity upon. The main course arrived then. A spectacular presentation that had clearly been prepared with extra care on Daniel's orders, the server explaining each component with the kind of detail typically reserved for food critics or special guests, the attention making it impossible for anyone at nearby tables to miss the preferential treatment I was receiving, their curious glances and whispered conversations adding to Morgan's visible discomfort as she found herself relegated to the role of observer at her own dinner party. Adam finally found the courage to speak, his voice uncertain as he asked how long I had known Daniel, the question revealing just how little he knew about my life before we met, how completely he had accepted his mother's version of who I was without ever bothering to discover the truth for himself, his ignorance now laid bare not just to me but to everyone at the table, including his mother, who was beginning to realize that her precious son might not be the prize she had always believed him to be. I answered his question with the same pleasant calm I had maintained throughout the evening, explaining that Daniel had been instrumental in my early career, that I had trained under him when his restaurant was first earning its reputation as one of the city's premier dining establishments, that many of the techniques and standards I had learned in his kitchen had served me well in my subsequent business ventures. Each revelation adding another layer to the picture of a woman far more accomplished and connected than any of them had imagined. The truth of my background impossible to dismiss or diminish. The dessert course provided the perfect finale to the evening's reversal of fortune. An elaborate creation that appeared at our table with Daniel himself in tow, his presence causing a stir throughout the dining room as he personally explained the inspiration behind the dish, mentioning casually that it was a variation on something I had helped him develop years ago. The acknowledgement of my creative contribution serving as yet another reminder to Morgan that I was not merely a guest in this world, but an active participant who had left my mark on it. As Daniel chatted briefly with our table, his manner making it clear that his warmth was directed primarily at me while maintaining professional courtesy toward the others, I caught Adam watching me with something like bewilderment, as if seeing me for the first time, the dawning realization in his eyes that he had aligned himself with his mother's narrow worldview at the expense of truly knowing his own wife. A failure that was becoming more apparent with each passing moment, as the evening revealed just how much he had missed. Morgan's final attempt to assert some kind of dominance came as we finished our coffee, her voice taking on a false brightness as she suggested it was getting late, and perhaps we should call it an evening. The transparent attempt to end the dinner before any further damage could be done to her carefully maintained image almost pitiable in its desperation. Her loss of control so complete that even Charlotte seemed embarrassed by her mother's obvious discomfort. I agreed pleasantly that it was indeed getting late, but not before making sure to thank Daniel personally for the exceptional evening, our farewell hug witnessed by the entire dining room and serving as a final, irrefutable demonstration of our genuine connection, the warmth between us standing in stark contrast to the frigid atmosphere at the Sinclair family table, where Morgan sat defeated, her carefully planned humiliation having backfired so spectacularly that it would become the stuff of legend in certain social circles. The walk to the restaurant's entrance felt different than my arrival, the staff nodding respectfully as I passed, other diners offering small smiles of acknowledgement. The shift in how I was perceived almost tangible as word of the evening's events spread through the room like wildfire. The story already being embellished and retold at other tables, ensuring that Morgan's failed power play would be remembered and discussed for weeks to come. Outside, as we waited for our cars, the silence between us was deafening. Morgan standing rigidly beside Adam while Charlotte and Emma huddled together whispering, none of them quite meeting my eyes as they processed the complete upheaval of their assumptions about my place in their world. The cool night air doing nothing to dispel the tension that crackled between us like electricity before a storm. Adam's hesitation, as he moved to follow his mother to her car, rather than leaving with me, was the final confirmation I needed. The last piece clicking into place as I realized that this marriage had never been what I thought it was. That I had been fighting for recognition from people who were incapable of seeing value in anything that didn't conform to their narrow definitions of worth. My years of patience and attempts to fit into their world finally revealed as the waste of time they had always been. The drive home alone gave me time to reflect on everything that had transpired. The evening's events crystallizing thoughts and decisions that had been forming in my mind for months, perhaps years. The clarity that came with finally standing up for myself illuminating just how much I had compromised and diminished myself in the futile pursuit of acceptance from people who had never intended to offer it. Their rejection of me having nothing to do with my worth and everything to do with their own limitations. By the time I reached our house, though I could no longer think of it as truly ours, my path forward was clear. The decision made not in anger or hurt, but with the kind of calm certainty that comes from finally seeing a situation for exactly what it is, without the filters of hope or denial that had clouded my vision for so long. The relief of accepting reality almost euphoric in its intensity, as I began planning my next moves. The late-night call to my attorney was brief and to the point, the wheels set in motion for what would be a swift and surgical separation. My instructions precise and comprehensive, as I laid out exactly how I wanted things handled. The documentation I had quietly been gathering over the years about to prove invaluable, as I prepared to extract myself from a marriage that had never been the partnership I had believed it to be. My business acumen finally being applied to the most important transaction of my personal life. Adam's arrival home hours later found me already packed, my essential belongings neatly arranged by the door. The symbolism of the suitcases impossible to miss, as he stumbled through the entrance. His face showing the effects of what had clearly been a difficult conversation with his mother, though I felt no sympathy for whatever distress he might be experiencing. My capacity for compassion finally exhausted after years of being spent on people who had never reciprocated it. The conversation that followed was remarkable only for its brevity. My explanations clinical and detached as I outlined my intentions, watching as the reality of the situation slowly penetrated his alcohol-fogged mind. The shock on his face almost comical as he began to grasp that I wasn't just leaving him but taking with me far more than he had ever realized I controlled. His assumptions about our financial arrangements about to prove as misguided as his mother's assumptions about my social standing. His threats about fighting the divorce, about making things difficult, about protecting his assets, fell flat as I calmly presented him with copies of the documentation that proved exactly how much of his supposed empire had been built on my initial investments, my financial backing, my strategic planning, realities he had either forgotten or never fully understood. His signature on documents he had never bothered to read properly now coming back to haunt him in ways he couldn't have imagined. The color drained from his face as he reviewed the paperwork, his mother's voice echoing in his head with all her pronouncements about gold diggers and social climbers now revealed as the projections they had always been. The truth being that I had entered this marriage with more assets and better business sense than he had ever possessed. My quiet accumulation of wealth and influence happening right under his nose while he remained blissfully ignorant, secure in his mother's version of reality. The final blow came when I informed him about the penthouse, watching as he struggled to comprehend that the property he had always assumed was his was actually in my name, purchased with my money, managed by my accountants, just one of many assets he had taken for granted, without ever investigating their true ownership. His privileged upbringing having instilled in him a casual disregard for financial details that was now proving to be his downfall. Walking out of that house for the last time, I felt no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of liberation, as I left behind not just a failed marriage, but an entire identity I had tried to force myself into. The role of accommodating daughter-in-law, finally discarded like an ill-fitting costume, replaced by the authentic self I had always been but had somehow allowed myself to forget in the pursuit of acceptance that was never going to come. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and financial untangling, Adam's initial bravado crumbling quickly, as the full scope of what he stood to lose became clear. His attorney's aggressive posturing evaporating the moment my legal team began presenting evidence of my majority ownership in his investment firm, documentation he had signed without reading, agreements he had entered into without understanding, his carelessness now costing him everything he had taken for granted. Morgan's attempts to intervene were almost entertaining in their desperation. Her furious phone calls and threatening messages serving only to reinforce the wisdom of my decision to sever all ties with the family. Her accusations of theft and manipulation ringing hollow when faced with the irrefutable legal documentation that proved everything I was claiming. her lifetime of dismissing me as intellectually inferior now preventing her from mounting any effective defense against my methodical dismantling of her son's financial position. The final divorce hearing was almost anticlimactic, the judge's ruling merely formalizing what had become inevitable from the moment I decided to stop playing by their rules. Adam's presence in the courtroom somehow diminished, as if the loss of his perceived financial power had stripped away whatever presence he once possessed, his mother notably absent, perhaps finally realizing that her interference would only make things worse for her son. Sitting in my penthouse afterward, looking out over the city skyline with a glass of champagne in hand, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment, the years of quiet preparation, the patience required to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal my true position, the satisfaction of watching their carefully constructed house of cards collapse entirely through their own arrogance and miscalculation, their underestimation of me proving to be their greatest vulnerability. The text messages from Adam in the following days were pathetic in their pleading, his sudden realization of what he had lost extending beyond mere financial considerations to the dawning awareness that he had never truly known the woman he married, his requests for reconciliation, for understanding, for just a chance to talk, all met with the same response, silence. The most powerful statement I could make after years of trying to make myself heard. The news of our divorce spread quickly through their social circle, the story of that dinner at Lucille d'Or having already become legendary, embellished with each retelling, until it had taken on mythic proportions. Morgan's humiliation complete as she found herself the subject of whispered conversations and barely concealed smirks at the very gatherings where she had once held court. Her fall from social grace as swift and decisive as my rise had been unexpected. Daniel's congratulatory message when the divorce was finalized included an invitation to return to his kitchen whenever I wished, not as a student this time but as a respected colleague and friend, the offer symbolic of how completely my position had changed, the validation of my worth coming not from the family I had left behind but from the relationships I had built on my own merit. Connections that had proven far more valuable than any society marriage could have been. The last I heard, Adam was struggling to maintain control of what remained of his business empire. His lack of actual business acumen finally exposed without my strategic guidance and financial support propping him up, while Morgan had retreated from much of her social calendar. The embarrassment of that evening at Lucille d'Or and its aftermath too fresh for her to face the people who had witnessed her downfall with such obvious enjoyment. As for me, I found myself energized by my newfound freedom, throwing myself into new business ventures with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. My reputation in both the culinary and business worlds actually enhanced by the story of how I had turned the tables on those who had tried to diminish me. The narrative of my triumph resonating with others who had faced similar situations. My experience becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people, based on prejudice and preconception. The irony wasn't lost on me, that Morgan's attempt to humiliate me had ultimately provided the catalyst for my liberation. Her carefully orchestrated dinner becoming the stage for her own downfall. The very public nature of her defeat ensuring that the story would be remembered and retold for years to come. A permanent reminder that true power comes not from inherited privilege or social position, but from genuine ability, strategic thinking, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Looking back, I realized that every slight, every ins. Looking back, I realized that every slight, every insult, every attempt to make me feel small, had only served to strengthen my resolve, building within me a resilience that Morgan and her family could never have anticipated. Their consistent underestimation of my capabilities, becoming the very weapon I would eventually use against them. Their arrogance blinding them to the careful accumulation of power and influence I had been orchestrating right under their noses for years. The true satisfaction came not from the financial victory, though that was considerable, but from the knowledge that I had remained true to myself throughout the ordeal, never stooping to their level of petty cruelty, instead choosing to defeat them through intelligence, preparation, and perfect timing. My triumph a testament to the value of patience and strategic thinking over emotional reactivity and social posturing, qualities they had dismissed as irrelevant in their narrow world of inherited privilege. Months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected call from Charlotte, her voice hesitant and uncertain, as she asked if we could meet for coffee. The request so out of character that curiosity compelled me to agree. Wondering what could have prompted this overture from someone who had spent years following her mother's lead in treating me as an unwelcome interloper in their family circle. Her participation in the campaign against me having been particularly cutting given our similar ages. The meeting revealed a Charlotte I had never seen before. Stripped of her usual armor of designer clothes and carefully cultivated superiority, her confession that she had been questioning everything since that night at Lucille d'Or, watching her mother's worldview crumble, had apparently triggered a crisis of conscience, forcing her to confront her own behavior and the toxic dynamics that had shaped her entire life. Her apology genuine if somewhat awkward as she struggled to articulate remorse for years of complicity in her mother's cruelty. I listened without judgment as she described the aftermath within the family, the way Morgan had become increasingly isolated and bitter, Adam's descent into depression and poor business decisions, Emma's decision to distance herself from the entire mess by accepting a job overseas. The family that had seemed so unified in their superiority, now fractured beyond repair. Their carefully maintained facade crumbling without the common enemy they had united against, revealing the hollow core that had always existed beneath their pretense of closeness. Charlotte's revelation that she had started seeing a therapist to work through the toxic patterns she had inherited from her mother felt like a strange form of vindication, proof that my refusal to accept their treatment had sent ripples through their entire family system, forcing at least one of them to question the values and behaviors they had always taken for granted. Her journey toward self-awareness beginning with the recognition that their treatment of me had been inexcusably wrong. The conversation ended with neither reconciliation nor continued hostility, but rather a sense of closure, both of us acknowledging that while the past couldn't be changed, the future held possibilities for growth and transformation that neither of us could have imagined when we were locked in our respective roles within the family drama. Her parting words expressing genuine admiration for how I had handled myself throughout the ordeal. A compliment that would have meant everything to me years ago, but now simply felt like confirmation of what I already knew about my own strength. Returning to my penthouse after the meeting, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come from the woman who had stood nervously at the entrance of Lucille d'Or, hoping for acceptance from people who were determined never to give it. That version of myself feeling like a distant memory now, replaced by someone who understood that true worth comes from within, and that the approval of others, while nice to have, is ultimately irrelevant compared to self-respect and authenticity. The success of my post-divorce business ventures exceeded even my own expectations. Freed from the constant emotional drain of navigating the Sinclair family dynamics, I found my creativity and strategic thinking operating at levels I hadn't experienced since before my marriage. My network of professional contacts expanding rapidly as word spread about my newly independent status. Opportunities presenting themselves that I never would have pursued, while trying to maintain the facade of being the acceptable daughter-in-law. Daniel's continued friendship and professional support proved invaluable as I explored new ventures in the hospitality industry, his introductions opening doors throughout the culinary world. The respect I commanded in these circles standing in stark contrast to the dismissive treatment I had endured from Morgan's social set, the difference highlighting just how arbitrary and meaningless their standards of worth had always been. based on nothing more substantial than inherited wealth and outdated notions of social hierarchy. The launch of my own restaurant consulting firm marked a full-circle moment in my professional journey, allowing me to help other establishments achieve the kind of excellence I had learned to appreciate under Daniel's tutelage. My unique combination of culinary knowledge and business acumen proving to be exactly what many struggling restaurants needed. The success stories accumulating quickly as word of mouth spread through the industry, my reputation growing with each transformed establishment. One particularly satisfying moment came when I was featured in a prominent business magazine's article about successful women entrepreneurs. The piece highlighting not just my professional achievements but also touching on my personal journey of overcoming adversity and reclaiming my power. Though I kept the details of my divorce relatively private, the mere mention of my name in such a context would undoubtedly reach Morgan's circles, serving as yet another reminder of how thoroughly she had misjudged me. The interview requests and speaking invitations that followed the article's publication gave me a platform to share my experiences with others who might be facing similar situations. My message consistently focused on the importance of knowing one's worth, maintaining financial independence, and never allowing others to define your value. Themes that resonated particularly strongly with women who had found themselves diminished or dismissed in either their personal or professional lives. I found unexpected fulfillment in mentoring young professionals, especially those from backgrounds similar to mine, who were trying to navigate industries dominated by inherited privilege and old money connections. My own experiences providing valuable lessons in how to build genuine influence through competence and strategic relationship building, rather than trying to conform to arbitrary social standards set by those who had never had to prove themselves. The ripple effects of that night at Lucille d'Or continued to surprise me, with people I had never met approaching me at industry events to share how the story had inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own situations. The narrative having taken on a life of its own as it spread through various professional and social networks, becoming something of a modern parable about the dangers of underestimating others and the power of patient, strategic thinking. A year after the divorce, I received word through mutual acquaintances that Adam's business had finally collapsed. His attempts to maintain the operation without my strategic guidance and financial backing proving futile, the investors pulling out one by one as his poor decisions accumulated, Morgan reportedly mortgaging properties to try to bail him out. Her lifetime of looking down on those who had to work for their success now coming back to haunt her, as she faced the possibility of genuine financial hardship for the first time. The schadenfreude I might have expected to feel at this news never materialized, replaced instead by a sense of detachment and even pity for people who had been given every advantage in life, yet had squandered it through arrogance and an inability to see value in anything outside their narrow worldview, their downfall entirely of their own making, a consequence of choices they had made long before I ever entered their lives. The opening of my own restaurant, a project I had been developing quietly with Daniel's guidance and support, marked the culmination of my journey from uncertain outsider to confident industry leader. The launch event, attended by an impressive array of culinary professionals, business leaders, and food critics, none of whom knew or cared about my previous connection to the Sinclair family, my identity now entirely my own, built on genuine achievements rather than marital associations. The restaurant's immediate success, with reservations booked months in advance and critics praising both the innovative menu and the impeccable service, served as the ultimate validation of everything I had worked for. The skills and knowledge I had accumulated over years of dedication to my craft finally given full expression in a venture that was entirely mine, unencumbered by the need to downplay my abilities or conform to someone else's limited expectations. It was during the restaurant's first anniversary celebration that I had my final encounter with Morgan. Her presence at the event unexpected, and initially unwelcome, until I realized she had come not as the imperious mother-in-law I had known, but as a woman humbled by circumstances. Her request for a private conversation revealing someone I barely recognized. The arrogance stripped away to reveal a person grappling with the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices and misplaced priorities. Her apology, when it finally came, was halting and difficult. The words clearly foreign to someone who had spent decades never admitting fault. Her acknowledgement of how wrong she had been about me, about everything, carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Though I suspected it was motivated as much by her current reduced circumstances as by any real understanding of the harm she had caused. The distinction ultimately irrelevant, as I had long since moved beyond needing anything from her, including apologies. I accepted her words with grace but without warmth, making it clear that while I harbored no active animosity, neither was I interested in any form of reconciliation or renewed relationship. The boundaries I had established in the wake of the divorce remaining firmly in place, my life having moved so far beyond the sphere of her influence, that even this conversation felt like an echo from a past that no longer had any power over me. The encounter served as a bookend to a chapter of my life that had begun with such hope and ended with such clarity. The journey from eager-to-please daughter-in-law to successful independent businesswoman, marking a transformation so complete that I sometimes struggled to recognize the person I had been when I first met the Sinclair family, that version of myself seeming impossibly naive now, though I felt gratitude rather than embarrassment for her optimism and determination to see the best in people. Standing in my office after Morgan's departure, looking out over a dining room filled with satisfied customers and a kitchen running with the precision I had always envisioned, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction, not just for what I had achieved but for how I had achieved it, staying true to my values even when it would have been easier to sink to their level, choosing strategic patience over emotional reactivity, building something meaningful rather than simply tearing down what had hurt me. The text message from Adam, that arrived weeks later, asking if we could talk about possibly working together on a new venture, was so tone-deaf and presumptuous that I actually laughed out loud. The suggestion that I might be willing to bail him out of his self-created problems, showing just how little he had learned from everything that had happened. His inability to recognize the permanence of the bridges he had burned, merely confirming the wisdom of my decision to sever all ties completely. My response was brief and professional, declining his offer without explanation or elaboration. The days when I felt obligated to justify my decisions to him or anyone in his family long past. My energy now focused entirely on continuing to build my empire, expand my influence, and mentor others who might benefit from my experience. The future stretching ahead, full of possibilities that had nothing to do with the Sinclairs or their rapidly diminishing world. The final irony came when Lucille Dorr contacted me about a potential collaboration with my restaurant, Daniel suggesting a special event that would showcase the techniques I had helped develop during my time training under him. The very venue where Morgan had attempted to orchestrate my humiliation, now seeking to celebrate my achievements. The symbolism almost too perfect as I agreed to the partnership that would bring my journey full circle in the most public way possible. The collaborative dinner was a massive success, with food critics praising the innovative fusion of classic techniques and modern creativity. The event covered extensively in both culinary and society publications, ensuring that anyone who remembered that infamous night when Morgan Sinclair had tried to exclude her daughter-in-law from dinner would now see the same woman being celebrated as an equal partner with one of the city's most respected restaurateurs. The reversal of fortune complete and undeniable. As I stood in the kitchen that night, working alongside Daniel and our combined teams to create something extraordinary, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the trials I had endured, but for the strength they had revealed within me. The person I had become through adversity far exceeding anything I could have achieved if I had been accepted into the Sinclair family's comfortable but limited world. Their rejection ultimately proving to be the greatest gift they could have given me. The evening ended with a standing ovation from the assembled guests, many of whom I recognized from the society circles I had once desperately wanted to join, their enthusiastic response to my work meaning something different now. Appreciated not as validation of my worth, but as recognition of excellence achieved through dedication and authentic talent, rather than inherited privilege or social connections. The applause a pleasant accompaniment to success rather than its measure. Months later, as my restaurant continued to thrive, and my consulting business expanded internationally, I received news that Morgan had sold the family estate. The property that had been in the Sinclair family for generations now passing to new owners. The liquidation of assets apparently necessary to cover debts accumulated through Adam's failed business ventures and continued poor decisions. Their fall from grace as complete as my rise had been unexpected, though I took no pleasure in learning of their difficulties. The realization that I had spent years trying to gain acceptance from people who were ultimately revealed to be less capable, less resilient, and less worthy than I had ever given them credit for served as a powerful reminder of how misguided it can be to seek validation from those who are determined to withhold it, their opinions rendered meaningless by their own limitations and prejudices, their judgment revealed as the hollow posturing of people who had never had to prove themselves through actual achievement. In the end, that night at Lucille Door had been a gift disguised as a humiliation, the catalyst I needed to stop diminishing myself for the comfort of others, and to finally claim the life I had always been capable of creating. Morgan's attempt to put me in my place, instead showing everyone exactly where I belonged, not beneath them, not beside them, but far beyond anything they could have imagined. Their small-minded cruelty transformed into the foundation of my liberation, an ultimate triumph. Retriclaude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.